بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. So we're continuing with what the scope of this book, what does he talk about? So the author, may Allah show, so the muhaqqiq, he says, summarizing again the book, he says, خامسا. What does Imam Tirmidhi talk about? He says خامسا التنبيه على أنواع من الأحاديث من حيث القبول أو الرد. بين فيه الحديث الحسن وقد ضبطه بتعريف بين فيه اصطلاحه في الحسن وهو أليق التعاريف بالحديث الحسن. Right? So he is arguably the first person to have defined Hasan Hadith, and at least it is his definition for a Hasan Hadith, right? So istilahu, this is his istilah. حكم زيادة الثقة وقد بين قبولها إذا كانت من ثقة يعتمد على حفظه وقد أفاد بهذا التنبيه فائدة هامة وأنه ليس كل ثقة تقبل زيادته وانظر مزيدا من تفصيل في الشرح وتعليقنا عليه. Right, so he said this whole issue of زيادة الثقة. If three people narrate a hadith and one person adds information, is that a mistake? Right, is that considered an anomaly? Or do we say زيادة, the fact that you've added more information, is like narrating a hadith that nobody else narrated? Like, how do you work with it? In reality, it's not that simple. Right? And so we point out that we see this in Sahih Muslim, for example. In Sahih Muslim, he'll say, وَفِي الرِّوَايَةِ كَذَا وَفِي الرِّوَايَةِ كَذَا. That doesn't actually mean that it's accurate. Right? And so it's not mutlaq. Right? When one hadith, one version of a hadith has more information or gives an extra condition or something like that, it's not unconditionally accepted. وهناك الحديث الصحيح لم يعرفه الترمذي اعتمادا على شهرته وظهور أمره. Right? Nobody says things that are obvious. Right? People don't come along and say things that are obvious. So he's not talking about that. For example, a politician who is asked about how the government is handling the war will not say that there is a war, by the way, because that's not news, right? That's not news. So there's no point. I mean, there's no point saying it. So people don't say things that are obvious. Well, hadith al-mursal, for example, is there a hadith? The Maghrib is, I used to pray 3 rakats Maghrib with the Prophet. I don't think there's a hadith like that because everybody is praying 3 rakat Maghrib. No, it's just defining the hadith, the concept of Sahih hadith. So the concept of Sahih hadith in the eyes of the muhaddithin is clear. So why would he talk about it? Right? So people talk about problems, they don't talk about non-problems. الحديث المرسل ومراده بالمرسل ما يشمل المنقطع كما هو اصطلاح الترمذي في جامعه واستعماله فيه وقد بين حكمه أنه لا يحتج به عند أكثر الحديث. Right? So if there's عند أكثر أهل الحديث. So it is mursal hadith, meaning so mursal or munqati' is the same thing. There's a gap in the chain, whether the Sahabi is dropped out or a Tabi is dropped out or somebody else. The point is a gap in the chain, and that there's obviously by default weak. الحديث منكر وقد ذكره في ضمن الغريب. So غريب we mentioned before. غريب is it's only rated by one person, right? And that becomes more of an issue depending on where we are in history. So are we Are we a Sahabi? Is this, for example, the only person who told you this is Sayyidina Abu Bakr because he was the only person with the Prophet ﷺ? That's not gharib, that's not problematic, right? It's technically gharib in that only Sayyidina Abu Bakr noticed the hadith, but it's not even a problem at all. Totally fine. But now, for example, as you go down in history, the likelihood of only one person knowing that hadith becomes less and less and less and less and less as you go through each generation. So it's problematic from that point of view. It's problematic because it's fishy. Why would you, out of all people, be the only person who knows this hadith? Right? So not just in time-wise, but in terms of narrators, who normally narrates from this person, who doesn't normally narrate from this person. Right? Why would you, even though you have a bad track record, you have previously narrated hadiths that we've never heard of, narrate hadiths from people that we've never heard had similar hadiths being narrated from, and suddenly you come along and narrate a hadith? I don't rely on you. So the gharib is is the problem. The problematic nature of the gharib is relative. Are we talking about you being a weak narrator? Are we talking about you being not a likely person to narrate this hadith from this person or this topic from this person, whatever it is? Is it, or is that not even a problem at all? Right? It's also called fard, right? It's also called fard, right? ما تفرد به راو, right? One narrator narrates, it's called the fard. But the word gharib has a negative connotation because it could be problematic, right? And even the word munkar, it is also sometimes borderline fabricated. So here's a hadith, the content sounds really strange. The narrator is muttaham bil kadhib. He's likely to be a liar. We think that he has lied previously in hadiths. We don't know that, right? And so the hadith sounds odd. He sounds like he could well be a liar. The two things now just tell us most likely this is totally off, right? And there's other definitions for hadith and munkar as well. وبهذا وبما سبق يكون قد تبين رد الحديث لثلاث أسباب هي الطعن في الراوي, stabbing, الطعن, criticizing the narrator كما سبق في أحكام الرواة, وتمثيله للحديث المنكر, والانقطاع الانقطاع في السند, there's a gap in the chain, والشذوذ, it being an anomaly. I trust you, but this doesn't make sense. كما يشير إليه تعريفه الحديث الحسن وقوله فيه لم يكن شاذا. It's not odd. It's not mentioning. And so we saw that many times in Sahih Muslim, that he's mentioning the content, looking at the contents, and the content of this hadith is odd. It goes against other information. كما يكون قد تبين قبول الحديث لاستيفائه صفات القبول بغيره كما في تعريف الحسن وبنفسه بالأولى, right? Who says and he also defines a Sahih hadith. How? By telling you the problems that could happen. So the opposite of those problems are going to be fine. So there's a complete chain. There's no gap in the chain. The narrators are reliable and there's no anomalies. Right? That's the basic picture. سادسا الكلام على الحديث الفرد, right? What's narrated by one person. سماه الحديث الغريب وقد تناول في بحثه كل أنواع التفرد وكيفياته, وجاء تقسيمه له مناسبا صحيحا جامعا لما فصله غيره كما أشرنا في تعليقنا. ومن هذا العرض نجد كتاب العلل من جامع الترمذي كتابا جامعا لأصول هامة لجامع الترمذي خاصة ولعلوم الحديث بصفة عامة, فإنها مسائل تتناول أركانا من أصول هذا العلم أثنى عليها العلماء الأئمة وذكروها في محاسن جامع الترمذي كما قال ابن أثير وفي آخره كتاب العلل قد جمع فيه فوائد حسنة لا يخفى قدرها على من وقف عليها. Okay, so it's a very nice book. Yes, it's primitive. Yes, it needs can be refined, but it's a very, it's one of the first books on علوم الحديث. العلل أول تأليف علوم الحديث. We mentioned this before. We spoke about this. Okay, our author, Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali. So he says, هو الإمام الحافظ العلامة زين الدين عبد الرحمن بن أحمد بن عبد الرحمن الملقب رجا رجب بن الحسن بن محمد بن الأبي البركاتي مسعود السلامة السلامي السلامي والسلامي I'm not sure البغدادي ثم الدمشقي الحنبلي الشهير بابن رجب وهو لقب جده عبد الرحمن واشتهرت نسبة الحافظ عبد الرحمن الحفيد إليه فقيل ابن رجب ولد الحافظ so he's from Baghdad um, he's originally from Baghdad da, da, da. Going on and on I want to skip a lot of these things سنة 36 و700 so in the 8th century right 736 right so he's there in the middle of the 7th and the middle of the 8th century right 8th 7th 8th century concept this is the time of nuduj of maturity of all of the ulum so somebody just by the fact that you are alive in that time means that sufficient work has been done for you to finalize things so Minhaj al-Talibin basically the same era. Alfiya of Ibn Malik, same era. Khalil ibn the Mukhtasar Khalil al-Maliki fiqh, I think after that. I'm pretty sure it's in the 8th century and 9th, 8th, 7th, 9th century. Allahu Alam. The Hanbalis, it's a little bit later for them, right? They kind of reach maturity in the 10th century, I believe, because they had less scholars, so they took more time. But otherwise, every single thing is Ibn Kathir at the same time. Why Tafsir Ibn Kathir? If you look at Tafsir al-Tabari versus Tafsir Ibn Kathir. Tafsir Ibn Kathir is more mature, right? Um, Usul al-Fiqh. Al-Amidi is similar time, I'm not sure. Mukhtasar Ibn Hajib, similar kind of time. So every single thing, every single ulum, by this time, 6, 7, 8. Yeah, so Ibn Qudama is not at that level, at that maturity level. He's in the 6th century, I believe, 5th, 6th century. Um, so, but that's so when you if you look at the Shafi school, for example, so um, like if you Imam Nawawi, so it's almost like Al-Mawardi. It's not really a complete comparison, but like Mawardi and Ibn Qudama, it's a similar kind of level of maturity, right? So Mawardi is before Ibn Qudama. Now, obviously, Imam Nawawi, he built on Ibn Qudama as well because he does comparative fiqh, etc. But in terms of maturity of the madhab, right? In terms of maturity of the madhab, the madhab is with Ibn Qudama is not as mature as it is in the 10th century. So really today, it's the 10th century. That's when you get kind of like the final cut of the Hanbali school, whereas for the Shafi'is, it's more like in the 7th, 8th centuries, right? But yes, we're going to use in the 10th century Ibn Hajar, Ramli, etc. But really, it's like with Imam Nawawi. Right? So in the Maliki school, Hanbali is Maliki, the Hanafi school. I'm not a Hanafi, can't really speak meaningfully about that, but that's kind of like sixth, seventh, this is kind of that maturity is there. So in hadith, mustalah hadith, right? You've got Ibn Salah, you've got Ibn Kathir, you've got all these people. So everything is reaching its maturity at that stage, right? Everything is reaching its maturity, meaning the final bricks. Someone's done this, they've done this, they've done this, then this. Anybody at that time, it's just easier to do the final thing, right? Like Einstein. Say, oh, Einstein is so intelligent. Not really. He's just because he's in a particular stage of history. So it was already being discussed, and he did the final brick, right? As Isaac Newton said, or at least is quoted to have said, if we saw far, we did but stand on the shoulder of giants. So that's a key concept, right? There's this cumulative effort that's happening, generation after generation after generation after generation after generation, and it just took somebody to be there to do it. You're not even that amazing. You just had to be there, right? So, and that's again a hyperbole. These are amazing people, right? Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, one of the greatest scholars ever. But the point is, because he's at a particular time, he can do things like that. He can do things that Imam Ahmad couldn't do because enough work has happened before him, if that makes sense. Um, so da 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 da. So he is a hadith scholar and a fiqih, right? That's what he is. And he mentions where he went and why he went. He says, وَقَدْ أَسْعَفَهُ الْحَظُّ بِالتَّلَقِّي عَنْ to receive كبار الأئمة في عصره فسمع بدمشق من فلان وفلان 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 وفلان. Um, so he writes from these people. It says ورافق شيخنا زين الدين العراقي في السماع كثيرا. Right, he narrates from the same kind of people as زين الدين العراقي, حافظ العراقي. Anyway, so he's at a stage of giants. So he says نبوغ, right? نبوغ ابن رجب ونباهة شأنه, right? So his standing out and how significant he was. أما في علم الحديث فقد بلغ درجة الإمامة في فنونه بل في أعمقها وأجلها وهو علم صناعة الأسانيد وفن العلل حتى صار موئل, right, the place that they go to, طلاب الحديث ومقصدهم. وصار أعرف أهل عصره بالعلل وتتبع طرق, right. وأما في الفقه, so I don't know, I'm not a Hanbali, can't speak. I know he has a book on قواعد. فقد برع فيه حتى صار من أعلام المذهب الحنبلي. وهذا كتابه القواعد الفقهية. I believe who is it? So famous Hanbali Salafi Sheikh in Saudi. Not Fawzan. Forget his name. Ibn Uthaymeen, yeah, Ibn Uthaymeen. He has a commentary on it. And I asked one Hanbali, and he's, so Ibn Uthaymeen is not, there's Hanbali and not Hanbali, but he has a commentary on the Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah. وهكذا جمع الحافظ ابن رجب بين الحديث والفقه ولم يفصل بينهما وهذا سبيله هو طريق المحدثين الكبار قلما تجد واحدا منهم إلا وهو متفقه بل مرجع في الفقه على أحد المذاهب المعمول بها خلاف لما اتبعه بعض من نصب نفسه محدثا في هذا العصر. Right? So there's a big difference between someone like Ibn Uthaymeen, again, who would disagree on many issues, but at least he is a faqih at the end of the day from one point of view. Someone like Sheikh Albani, who's not. Right? Um, okay. Anyway, he's amazing. We don't really need to. Just read his books and you'll see how amazing he is. Right? And his writing is very Sufi as well. He's continually like putting very kind of a lot of Sufi stuff. So again, by this time, um, so you look at everybody is Sufi, right? In the general sense, is he in a tariqah specifically? Not necessarily. Many of the Hanbalis are Qadiri, but basically a lot of his works, like you see, it's like there's all this Sufi stuff everywhere, right? There's things he talks about, which you can't really not. It's not, you know, in the general sense. Yeah, it's probably the best. Well, okay, so some of his books. Uh, So it says شرح جامع الترمذي في 20 مجلدا 20 volumes وقد مر بك الثناء عليه ولم نعثر منه إلا على هذه القطعة التي هي شرح على الترمذي. So we don't have, apparently it exists, we don't have any of it. شرح البخاري لم يكمل ولم يكمله وصل فيه إلى الجنائز وسماها فتح الباري. Then 40 hadith, and that's basically it. And he has an important book on it's important. It is important on the former dhahib, why you have to follow the former dhahib, etc. So he's an amazing scholar, a very unique, amazing scholar. So let's skip and go into his sharh. There's more of a description. We don't need to go through all of these things. The manuscripts very important. So again, when you're reading a book that doesn't talk about manuscripts is meaningless, right? So I remember, for example, once um, I bought Al-Ibana by في أصول الديانة by Al-Ash'ari, by Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. So here's a book written by one of the most important, somebody speaking on Aqidah ever. And the book just begins. There's no discussion about where the manuscript is. So how do I know that the author wrote this book like this? So today, when we're talking about asanid, we mean manuscripts. That's what we mean. Like, that's the significant thing, right? Many people have asanid. I have asanid for a million things. It doesn't really mean that much. But when you have the editor goes through and say, what are the manuscripts, comparing the manuscripts, what are the relative use of the different manuscripts? Was it complete? The state of it, the where it's found, all these kind of things. This is how we kind of find out if a book is even written or not, right? So he has to talk about those things. So if you open a book and it has no manuscript discussion, this is not a real book, right? Some early muhaqqiqeen, like in like the early 20th century, they would do that, but that's not something that's like really useful. Um, Similarly, the Diwan of Umar ibn Abi Rabi'a, I just don't know. I bought a copy of it. It just says the Diwan, or who collected this Diwan? What are the manuscripts? Where does it come from? No idea. It's just there. The Diwan of Imam Shafi. Okay, well, who collected that Diwan? What are the who made it, put it together? What are the sources? Nothing. So a lot of books, commercial books are written like that. There's just no reference. Like where on earth did this thing come from? No idea. It's just a book, right? Which doesn't really make any sense, right? Um, you know. So that's an important concept. Okay, manuscripts, etc. So it's important that it's there. We don't need to read it all though. Um, and he says what he has done, etc. And he's going to go through examples of the manuscript, and then he's going to start the book. So that's the end of the beginning. Right, that's the first PDF there. So then he's going to start the actual book. So key concept, you buy a book and it says Sharh al-Tirmidhi, and then it just starts. How did it just start? Right, there's all these quotes here, and then the book just starts. Right, it's going to say here. Uh, so a book that just starts, you can't. That doesn't mean there's no standard for it. Like, what is this book? Where did it come from? It's hard, yeah, it's quite hard. Also, there's different manuscripts, different ages, different all sorts of things. We have some manuscripts from a long time ago. We have the original manuscript of Ar-Rabi', his original script of the Risala. We have that. That's Imam Shafi's scribe. We actually have that manuscript. Other things you have different copies. It's hard to read. I'll share. Just give me 1 second. I'll just pause the recording. I'll just share something on the group. Okay. So he says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Qala Shaykhuna. So key concept we learn in Hadith, which transfers immediately over to manuscripts, is it says Qala Shaykhuna. Okay. So it says our teacher. Who is our? Who is we? Right. A Hadith is narrated by somebody who narrates it. Right. Bukhari said. Who is saying that Bukhari said? Right. We saw this in the Tamyiz. Uh, um, Once there was some discussions, and it was clear that that discussion was actually from the narrator of Imam Muslim, not Imam Muslim himself, the person who narrates from Imam Muslim, the person who's actually quoting this book to us. Right. So everything comes with something. As one of my teachers said, the concept of isnad is so fundamental that even when authors were writing a story, they would make a fake sanad for it because it just sounds odd, right? It's like things don't come out of nowhere. So if you look at the Maqamat of Hamadani, which is all the stories, it'll say Haddathana Isa ibn Hisham, right? Everything has a chain of transmission because otherwise, where does it come from? Right? So we are kind of in certain sciences we don't usually do that much, but in principle it's very important. Like where do things come from? So it says قال شيخنا الشيخ الإمام العالم العلامة شيخ الإسلام حافظ مصر والشام أوحد العلماء والأعلام أوحد أبو الفرج أبو الفرج عبد الرحمن زين الدين بن رجب البغدادي الحنبلي فسح الله في مدته May Allah give him his long mudda. Allah, right? وختم له ب what is it? Oh, بخير في عافية في عافية بمنه وكرمه في كتاب شرح الترمذي له. كتاب العلل فصل ابتناء ابتناء the word بنى hangs built جامع الترمذي على عمل العلماء بالحديث. So is this quote that it says هذا العنوان إضافة أدرجناها للدلالة على غرض. This is very important. The editor has said we have put this in here. This is not in the manuscript. So he says قال أبو عيسى رحمه الله جميع ما في هذا الكتاب من الحديث معمول به وقد أخذ به بعض أهل العلم ما خلا حديثين هما حديث ابن عباس أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم جمع بين الظهر والعصر بالمدينة والمغرب والعشاء من غير خوف ولا سقم, right? Sickness. He says here كذا في النسخة في النسخة الأصل is a صفة here, right? وفي طبعة الحلبي من غير خوف ولا سفر ولا مطر وقد سبق الحديث عند الترمذي في ظرف من غير خوف ولا مطر. Right? So in another print of this, so this is what we find in the print here. This is a problem because it says that's not what the hadith says. It's not min ghayri khawfin wala suqm. So this doesn't make sense. This is clearly a mistake because in another print of this book it says min ghayri khawfin wala safar wala matar. And what Tirmidhi actually narrates in Tirmidhi is min ghayri khawfin wala matar. So clearly a mistake. Right? So here's a question. Ibn Hajar or somebody Ibn Rajab or somebody made a mistake here. So clearly this is shadh, right? This quote here is off. Does that discount the whole book? No. So the concept that a weak narrator is discounted, that's ridiculous. Also, that happens all the time. وحديث النبي Ibn Hajar in Bulugh al-Maram, right? He'll say, oh, this hadith is in Nasa'i. He's like, it's not actually Nasa'i. So he makes mistakes. That does not mean that Ibn Hajar doesn't count anymore. وحديث النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أنه قال إذا شرب الخمر فاجلدوه فإن عاد في الرابعة فاقتلوه, right? وقد بينا علة الحديثين جميعا في هذا الكتاب, right? So the argument of Tirmidhi is these two hadiths have not been acted upon by anybody, and Imam Nawawi disagrees. Imam Nawawi points out, for example, that this hadith, yes, this hadith has been applied, and the concept of joining for need does exist, and that's the ikhtiyar of Imam Nawawi. And I believe this hadith, he says it is a hadith and it is sahih, but it is just mansukh, that's all. Right, he says امتاز جامع الترمذي الإمام الترمذي الإمام جامع امتاز جامع الإمام الترمذي بخصائص هامة تفرد بها بين كتب السنة منها بيانه تفقه العلماء بالحديث. تفقه usually means becoming a faqih. Maybe he means like how they understood hadith. بأن يذكر مذاهبهم فيما دل عليه حديث الوارد في شيء من أحكام وابتناء انتقاء الأحاديث الكتاب على هذا الأصل. That this book, the selection of these hadith is based on this. وقد بين الترمذي ها هنا قاعدة جليلة لها أهمية كبيرة وهي أن جميع ما في الجامع من الأحاديث معمول به أي لم يجمع على ترك العمل به ما خلا حديثين ولهذا البيان دلالة على قوة الكتاب من هذه الحيثية ونفع عظيم للفقيه كي لا يعمل بحديث منسوخ بدلالة الانعقاد على خلافه أو لكونه متأولا على غير المتبادر منه. متبادر منه, that which is the most obvious, أو معلن بعلة جعلته مخالفا للإجماع. Right, so the concept of the hadiths have acted, we see this throughout history. You'll find there was some scholar, not a scholar, but a kind of, thinker in Egypt. He's saying, why did I not follow the former dhahib? Says the problem with the former dhahib is they're based on weak hadiths, like non-stop. And that's true. The former dhahib frequently based their opinions on weak hadiths. That is not a problem with them, that's a problem with you. That's because you don't understand what they're doing. So they are the standard, not you. Right? They're the imams, right? So if it's just one madhab that does this, or just, okay, fine, happens like that, right? But when you see it, it's like countless ahadith that are weak that everybody acts upon, and countless ahadith that are sahih that nobody or most people don't act upon. That happens like a lot, happens a lot. So the idea that we act upon sahih hadith, we don't act upon weak hadith, that's a major hyperbole, right? Or a gross oversimplification. That's fairly not very useful. And so a key concept of the fuqaha is it acted upon or not, right? It's a key concept. We spoke about that in our class on pluralism. Those of you who've seen that lecture on pluralism. So كأن مراد الترمذي رحمه الله تعالى أحاديث الأحكام، وقد سبق الكلام على هذين الحديثين اللذين أشار إليهما ها هنا في موضعها من الكتاب، وذكرنا مسالك العلماء فيها من النسخ وغيره، وذكرنا أيضا عن بعضهم العمل بكل واحد منهما. So Imam Ibn Rajab says, with all due respect, number one, we've mentioned the whole issues. Number two, actually some people did act upon these hadiths. So then he mentions the whole discussion here. But clearly we can see that Ibn Rajab did write the rest of the book. So he's writing this part at the end of a book, and we only have this part of it. We don't have the rest of it, right? Which is very common. We don't have books, right? It's common that we know about books that have existed in the past, but we don't have access to them. It goes on and on and on. You can read that whole thing yourself. وقوله وقد بينا علة الحديثين جميعا في الكتاب فإنما بين ما قد يستدل به للنسخ لا أنه بين ضعف إسنادهما. Right, so he explained why they've been abrogated, not why they're weak. وقد روى الترمذي في كتاب الحج حديث جابر في التلبية عن النساء ثم ذكر الإجماع على أنه لا يلبى عن النساء. Right, they do the talbiyah, you don't do talbiyah for them. فهذا ينبغي أن يكون حديثا ثالثا مما لم يؤخذ به عند الترمذي. Right, so just saying this istidrak. Again, these chapters here, this is from Dr. Nuruddin Attar. فصل في سرد أحاديث اتفق العلماء على عدم العمل بها، وقد وردت أحاديث أخر قد ادعى بعضهم أنه لم يعمل بها أيضا، وقد ذكرنا غالبها في هذا الكتاب، فمنها ما خرجه الترمذي وأكثرها لم يخرجه. فمنها حديث من غسل ميتا أو ميتا فليغتسل ومن حمله فليتوضأ. So allegedly nobody's acted upon this. So apparently nobody's acted upon this hadith, that we do act upon it. Maybe the wujub is not enacted upon, but it's sunnah, and I believe even wajib in the Hanbali school. Allahu a'lam. وقد قال الخطابي أبو سليمان الخطابي, the commentator on Abu Dawood and the great scholar of hadith and fiqh and Arabic language, لا أعلم أحدا من العلماء قال بوجوب ذلك, right? وجوب ذلك. ولكن القائل باستحبابه يحمله على الندب وذلك عمل به. Right. ومنها حديث أنه توضأ ثلاثا وقال من زاد على هذا أو نقص فقد أساء وظلم، وقد ذكر مسلم الإجماع على خلافه, that nobody applied this. right? I.e. wujub, right? But in the Shafi school, it is makruh to wash more than 3 times, or possibly haram as well, in certain scenarios, and makruh to do less. Right? ومنها حديث التيمم إلى المناكب والآباط. Right. So when you're making tayammum, to wipe all the way up to one's shoulders and up to one's armpits. So this is in Abu Dawood and Nasa'i and other places. ومنها حديث التيمم إلى نصف الذراعين, only going up to halfway through your forearms. ومنها حديث الأكل في الصوم بعد الفجر, that you can eat while you're fasting after Fajr comes in, before sunrise. Right. So it says, right. قال تسحرنا مع رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وكان النهار, right, i.e. the وجد النهار إلا أن الشمس لم تطلع لم تطلع, right. He says وهو حديث تفرد به عاصم بن أبي النجود. This is العاصم, قراءة عاصم. And we're talking about قراءة عاصم, حفص and عاصم. This is عاصم. So he's a imam in قراءة, 50-50 in رواية. And so Al-Munawi, he mentions it. He says, approximately. Right? But nobody's acted upon this hadith. Again, it's a hyperbole that nobody's acted upon hadith. It does exist. Right? ومنها حديث الأكل في الصوم بعد الفجر. Um, وقال الجوزجاني, this is early hadith scholar, وهو حديث قد أعيا العلماء معرفته. So key concept. Um, the asanid of talaqqi of fiqh is one thing, the asanid of talaqqi of hadith is something else. How fiqh has reached us, how hadith has reached us, not the same. Fiqh has reached us through the work of the fuqaha, of the Sahaba and Tabi'een, and their students. Hadith has reached us through other paths. The Shafi school tries to merge those two paths, okay? But it's not really merging in the sense that merging. So that's why you will find, if you look at Tirmidhi saying, no, this is what the fuqaha say, but this is what the hadith says. That's actually a difference. There is actually a clear difference. So the Salafi movement, you have a lot of material to criticize things because there is an inconsistency. Here's a hadith, it's sahih, yeah, nobody acts upon it. Here's a hadith, it's sahih, but nobody acts upon it, right? And that's very important to understand. Right, that's really important to understand. That um, and so look, we read in Ali al-Madini, for those again, see my discussion about the different madhahib and orthodoxy, etc. The madhahib come out the madhahib of the Sahaba and Tabi'een, right? And so the hadith is there to tweak these madhahib, as opposed to somebody come along and say, no, I just base Quran and Sunnah. Nobody actually does that. None of the fuqaha ever did that. And so that's why you're going to find Joseph Jani, he's saying, the fuqaha coming from one system, see this hadith, like, what are you talking about? We've never heard of any of the fuqaha saying that you can start fasting in once Ramadan has already come in. That's impossible. So it doesn't make any sense, right? And so a key concept for the fuqaha is the hadith exists or the ayah exists, but what do the fuqaha do? Right? And then that's the most obvious and most overt case of that is Imam Malik, where Imam Malik quotes the hadith and says, لَيْسَ الْعَمَلُ عَنْدَنَا كَذَا. What do we do in Medina is this. That's a very key concept for them. Right? And it's not just for them, it's for everybody. Right? Many quotes from Imam Ahmad about this, that the hadith is weak, but alayhi al-amal, but we will act upon it. وفي أكل البرد للصائم, that the person who's fasting can eat barad, hail. ومنها حديث ابن أم مكتوم وأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يرخص له في ترك الجماعة مع ما ذكره من ضرره وعدم قائد والسيول. Right, so there's the hadith, a blind person saying, Ya Rasulullah, I don't have, I'm blind and I don't have anybody to lead me to the mosque. So he said, okay. And then he said, hang on a minute, can you hear the adhan? He said, yes. He said, you got to be there then. Right? So applying it in its absolute sense, well, the best example in reality is the hadith of ghusl on Jum'ah. So there's about like three sahih hadiths about that it's wajib to make ghusl on Jum'ah, but nobody says it's wajib to make ghusl on Jum'ah. Right? So that there's many cases like that. It's important to understand. Right? Yeah, and so it's not totally wrong, but as a so on and juz'iyat sometimes it's fine, but what you see as when it becomes a universal system that I actually don't care what the four madhahib say. I actually don't really care that there's no precedent to what I'm saying. If the hadith is sahih, it's my madhab, goodbye. Like that's it becomes ridiculous because actually your fiqh is not the fiqh of Bukhari, of Muslim, of Imam Ahmad, of Ishaq Ibrahim, of Ishafi, of Malik. It's not anybody, right? Right, and so that's it's not even an issue of that. The fact that nobody acts upon it, that's sufficient, right? So it's a methodological problem. What it means is the hadith has a problem. You might not know what it is, but it clearly has a problem. The fact that nobody acts upon it, right? So it's a methodological problem that stems from ignorance and pride, to the two of them. Ignorance, you don't know what's going on, so you're kind of surprised the hadith is sahih and you didn't know that most people act upon it. And pride, that you don't actually care what they say, right? I don't actually care. It's not even like I just assume that I know more than them and that's it, which is not the case. Even the whole concept, okay, no, everybody just followed Sahih Hadith. That is not true. That is clearly not true. You're going to find every single Imam seeing a Sahih Hadith and not acting upon it, and seeing a weak Hadith and then acting upon it. Every single Imam. So it's a gross oversimplification. How do you establish that Qira'ah recital is authentic, or is it just a mistake So again, for the Asanid. So the fact that this is Hafs and Asim, that's the basic picture. So in reality, there's three conditions, but um, the, but the basic picture is that it comes through Asanid. And so we have a similar kind of conflict between Hadith and Fiqh, which is between um, Qira'ah and Nahu. So you have a Qira'ah, and it doesn't make sense in terms of Arabic. It's confusing. Who was it? I believe it was Farra, right? Early Kufan grammarian. He criticizes the idgham of the lam sakina into the ra. So he says, no, other way around. Ra into the lam. Allahumma ghfilli, Allahumma ghfilli. Right? That's a qira'ah. So he said, this is wrong. Whoever recites that, that's wrong. You don't do idgham of a ra into a lam. You can do idgham of the lam into the ra, but not ra into the lam. That's incorrect Arabic. Like that's not how it's done. So he's criticizing it from an Arabic point of view. Like that is not Arabic. That is not how the science or how we speak Arabic. You never do idgham of a um, of a ra into a lam. You do idgham of the lam into the ra. And then over time, others said that's not actually true, right? But it represents that same conflict. There's the confluence of two opposing systems. So Imam Shafi'i is the best example of this confluence of these two opposing systems, right? That he is Nasir Sunnah, meaning we're going to apply the hadith unless this, right? But the key difference with Imam Shafi'i is he begins with the fiqh al-salaf, fiqh of the salaf, and then edits, as opposed to the Salafis begin with nothing. So I begin with hadith. So if there's no hadith, then there's no fiqh. There's no ruling, period. So they're starting with zero and he's starting with something. So he's starting with a basis. You're going to see his proofs are often going to be Sahaba, Tabi'een, right? Unless there's a Sahih hadith that goes against it. As opposed for them, they say, no, there's no hadith, so therefore don't act upon it. So you're going to see with them, their approach, it cuts everything out, right? It's a search engine. They're using a search engine that cuts a lot of the search results out. Whereas Imam Shafi'i, he brings a lot of research in because it's actually a very different system. It's a very, very different system. Anyway, للحديث بقية we can talk at length more about that. So that hadith وقد ذكر بعضهم أنه لا يعلم أحدا أخذ بذلك, right? That it's obligatory to go to Jum'ah even if it's difficult, to go to Jama'ah even if it's difficult, even if there's clear harm, right? So there's water flowing down the street and little rivulets everywhere. You don't have a guide and you're blind, right? So obviously that's an excuse. ومنها أحاديث النهي عن كرى الأرض, that you can't rent out land. وهي أحاديث صحيحة ثابتة, right? ومنها أحاديث المسح على النعلين ذكره الطحاوي وغيره, that you can't, the wiping on sandals. ومنها حديث أن في 25 من الإبل 5 شياه, right, which is am I mistaken here? Don't we all say that? Oh, no, we don't. Yeah, because now we start giving a camel at that point. You don't give 5. Right? So it says here, yeah. He says وجماهير علماء على خلاف ذلك لما صح من الحديث الكثيرة أن في 25 من الإبل إلى 35 بنت مخاض أنثى, فيكون حديث الخمس شياه. This is إضافة by the way. فيكون حديث الخمس شياه شاذا. So this is مضاف, what's called إضافة لفظية. You can still have the L here, right? The 5 sheep. الخمس شياه. ومنها حديث توريث المولى من أسفل, وقد ذكرنا الكلام عليه. And he mentions it here. Anyway, so we don't have to go into all of these. ومن حديث الرضاع أنه لا يحرم إلا 10 رضاعات. Right, it has to be 10 instances of suckling for the child to become the mahram of the mother. Right, nobody says that. ومنها حديث جمع الطلاق الثلاث. But 3 count as 1. منها حديث أسماء بنت عميس في إحداد المتوفى عنها 3 أيام. So that you only have to, so if a woman loses her husband, she does إحداد, she dresses differently, etc., and performs certain things only for 3 days. ومنها حديث سلمة ابن محبق في من وقع على جارية امرأته. What if somebody sleeps with his wife's slave girl, right? ومنها أحاديث متعددة في الحج. ومنها نهي عن التمتع, you can't do تمتع. There's countless hadiths. ومنها أن المعتمر إذا مسح الركن حل, like if you're in sorry, the mu'tamir, if you're on Umrah, as soon as you touch the Kaaba, that's it, you are out of ihram, right? Nobody acts upon that. Yeah, so some of these things can be debated, right? حديث أن الوقوف في عرفة لا يفوت إلا بطلوع الشمس يوم النحر, right? And everybody says no, it's that's what we say. So here it says, here saying, this hadith, people have claimed that nobody acted upon it, and that is the reality in the Shafi school, for example. Right? Yeah. Oh, see, I'm reading it wrong. بقية طلوع الشمس, sorry. Yeah, of course, طلوع الشمس. So you have to, yeah, so the Arafah, you miss Arafah by طلوع Fajr. So I was like, what am I missing here? Right? But as opposed to the sun has to rise on Eid, no, you've already missed Arafah. And it goes on and on and on, etc. And here, for example, al-ittiba' in Sa'i between Safa and Marwa, we do this uh, in the Shafi school. قال الشافعية بسنة الاتضاع في السعي على القول الصحيح في مذهبهم. Right? So anyway, there's certain hadith like that have been claimed that have not been acted upon. Okay, and inshallah وقد ادعى بعضهم ترك العمل بأحاديث أخر وهو خطأ ظاهر كدعوى ابن قتيبة الإجماع على ترك العمل بالأحاديث المسح على الإمامة. Right? That's just totally wrong. Right? And that's so that there's a quote from Imam Ahmad. He said, من ادعى الإجماع فقد كذب فقد كذب كذب فقد كذب. Right? Whoever claims that this consensus has lied. Meaning, most of the time people claim things and it's just simply because they're unaware. Like Ibn Abdul Barr will frequently do that. He will say there's ijma' on this, and it's like there's not ijma' on that. There's consensus of the opinions that you're aware of, right? Like so, people will say, the Ummah has agreed that you can't use calculations to prove Ramadan. I mean, that's not true. Number one, it's not ijma'. And number two, it's arguably the relied upon position in the Shafi school that you can use calculations as an individual. So the point is there's adam ad-diqqa, right? Or, what exactly is being said in an absolute sense, inshallah. So we'll come back to this, inshallah, next week. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله